Ms Clarke.
Thank you. The Australia Institute's submission is focused on proportionate and targeted regulation of lobbying. Limiting access to Parliament House would be the wrong way to regulate lobbying. The most powerful commercial interests don't need access to Parliament House to access ministers and parliamentarians. It's civil society, academics, trade unions, community groups and other members of the public who depend on access to Parliament House in order to access decision makers. At the moment, you have to be an insider to even get the forms to apply for a sponsored pass. This information should be public. In addition, the proliferation of sponsored passes is in part a consequence of unescorted day passes being abolished. Since a representative of a smaller interest group is unlikely to travel to Canberra often and more likely to fill their day at Parliament with multiple meetings, bringing back unescorted day passes would be a practical step towards both more equitable access to Parliament House and reduced use of sponsored passes. We also propose other limited passes which could be sufficient for some individuals who currently hold sponsored passes, such as those who need access only to press areas of Parliament. Lobbyist influence could be revealed and possibly reduced by publishing ministerial diaries and requiring documents produced as part of representations to government to be proactively disclosed. This allows public scrutiny of who is telling government what and when. 4 out of the 6 states already disclose ministerial diaries or have committed to do so. Regulation being limited to third-party lobbyists, as is current practice, allows in-house lobbyists to operate without oversight. Third-party lobbyists are a small minority of all lobbyists, so the lobbyist register should be expanded to in-house corporate lobbyists. Even the oversight of third-party lobbyists is weak, relying on individual public servants to take the initiative to report violations to the Code of Conduct. The only listed sanction for violating the Code of Conduct is being deregistered. There is no listed sanction for lobbyists lobbying while unregistered. We recommend a review into possible stronger sanctions for non-compliance. Thank you.
Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier we had a discussion about lobbyist access, and the Chair talked about lobbyists not just walking around. It absolutely has been my experience that in-house lobbyist-sponsored pass holders just sort of will waltz into your office unannounced and seek a meeting, and at times when votes are happening in the chamber, even representatives from groups like the Minerals Council camped out in front of the office wanting to chat about an upcoming vote. So I think there is an issue there. In the Australian Institute's, in your submission, much of it goes to democratizing access to Parliament House, including making process and procedures around applying for passes clearer and more accessible. Why is this important? Why did you recommend that?
In part because civil society groups, community organisations, academics, trade unions and so on depend on coming to the press gallery and to ministers and to parliamentarians at their place of work in order to make representations. They don't have the capacity to arrange access with decision makers outside of this building with nearly as much ease as some of the more powerful groups. I think it also preserves Parliament House as a place of democratic debate and discussion that people feel like they can access. There was quite a valuable paper, one of the Senate discussion papers about 20 years ago, where Francis Sullivan talks about how if people better understood parliamentary processes, they might trust the democratic system and how decision-making works a bit better. And getting people into the building and having them see that and be part of it, I think, is a really important part of increasing trust.
Thank you. You recommend restoring the unescorted day pass system and potentially, as you said in your opening statement, creation of a new pass restricted to sections of the building, say the press gallery. Can you explain the history of the unescorted day pass and why you think it'd be a good thing to bring it back?
Yeah, so the unescorted day pass required the person applying for a pass to have a meeting to be signed in, but then they were free to walk around the building unescorted. In 2014, the Abbott government abolished it with the support of the opposition, or at least they didn't object to it. I think national security reasons were cited, but I didn't see kind of a particular case that had precipitated that decision. And yeah, I think that bringing it back, well, firstly then, what we see after the abolition of the unescorted pass is the dramatic growth in the number of sponsored passes. It's hard to tell, correlation and causation, but it seems likely that people who used to be able to rely on the unescorted pass have ended up applying for a sponsored pass instead, because that made their work possible in this building. So I think bringing that back would help reduce the demand on the sponsored pass system.
Just finally, before I hand back to the chair, one of the things that's blown my mind about the system we have in Australia is the lack of any penalty for breaching the code of conduct. Deregistration for a maximum of 3 months. There's no fine, or in some jurisdictions they look at criminal penalties. And at estimates, the AG's department has told me that this hasn't even happened. I'm interested, do you have a view on why the penalties appear so inadequate and so weak?
I'm not sure if it's just that it's never been kind of pursued kind of decisively enough that this problem exists. We've suggested an inquiry into what sanctions could exist. I think that's particularly important if the definition of a lobbyist is expanded. You'd want to make sure that it was proportionate to all the different types of people who might then be covered. But yeah, I don't know what the history is there or why it has remained so weak. There's a distinction between lobbying and being a lobbyist. So in our submission, we've taken the kind of lobbyist code of conduct definition of lobbying as perfectly good to represent what it means to lobby. But many people who do that will not themselves be lobbyists. And I think Senator Pratt's point about disadvantaged groups and people with lived experience is a classic example of that. It would be very natural to talk to an MP or minister about your own experience and then outline some recommendations for what the government should do to address family violence or the treatment of asylum seekers or whatever else, and end up lobbying them without yourself being a lobbyist. I don't object to making more people required to follow the lobbyist code of conduct or even necessarily be on the register. But maybe then it needs to be a lobbying register rather than a lobbyist register to avoid creating that association. I think the sponsored passes does represent repeat players, but it does include people whose work in the building is not primarily about making representations to government. For example, accessing media areas of the building, but perhaps a combination where you do create alternatives to the sponsored passes and then create more obligations for those who do still keep their sponsored passes is a good way to strike a balance between those two.
Your point about access to media areas of the building is an interesting one, but if you give someone access to the media areas, you give someone access to the building, effectively, as it stands at the moment. And so how do you make the distinction?
All at this point,
unless you're going to put RFID trackers or something like that on them to make sure they don't go where they're not supposed to be, and I think we're starting to get into dangerous territory there.
Yeah, so I think it would be, to some extent, self-enforcing, but the model we had in mind was something like how access to the ministerial wing is already limited. You could have an expectation that those with the media passes don't go into
That's not right. Someone who has access to the private areas of the building has access to the ministerial wing.
My understanding is that if I don't have a meeting, I'm not supposed to go into that wing, but well, I could be wrong.
Well, that's probably what it says somewhere on a piece of paper, but there's one corridor in the building, and that's the PM's corridor, and I'm probably breaching some security protocol by saying that. That's monitored in a security sense. The rest of the building is accessible.
I guess
we don't need to debate it. I suppose I'm just making a point. I just want to go on to something else. In respect of the publication of ministerial diaries, and there's possibly different levels of that. Queensland has been mentioned on a couple of occasions. Is the publication based on meetings with lobbyists, or is it in any way redacted in the varying jurisdictions that you've looked at?
I can jump in if you like. So it definitely does depend on jurisdiction. I haven't delved into each of them, but for example, whether meetings with public servants are disclosed or not seems to vary based on the place. And I think there's also debate over what represents a meeting or an official diary entry. So is it things that have been arranged earlier, or does someone go in afterwards and fill in things that have occurred that weren't scheduled? So I think absolutely you'd need to look at how it's been done in practice and what the potential omissions are to see what's a kind of as broad as possible without breaching confidences. For example, I think most of them distinguish between meeting with a constituent to talk about the constituent's business from someone's ministerial duties.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.